Today, the latest weapons, coupled with the fighting skill of the American soldier, stand ready, on the alert all over the world to defend this country, you, the American people, against aggression. This is The Big Picture, an official television report to the nation from the United States Army. Now, to show you part of the big picture, here is Sergeant Stuart Queen.
If you had somehow slept through the last decade and a half, you would never have known about the proud men of the 24th Infantry Division. For this division was created for our own troubled times. But in its brief history, it has written an heroic record which assures it a place of glory in the military annals of this nation. The 24th Division was formed out of the old Hawaiian Division shortly before Pearl Harbor. And it fought bravely in many of the decisive battles in the Southwest Pacific that followed. With victory, it went on occupation duty in Japan. When war came again, the men of the 24th were the first Americans to reach the bitter and tragic soil of Korea. This is the story of their magnificent performance there.
On a hilltop 30 miles south of Seoul, overlooking the ancient valley town of Osan, Korea, a monument to the recent past is dedicated. The long and bitter struggle in Korea is a page of history now, but one whose importance and meaning will endure forever. And this monument commemorates the first American soldiers to begin to write it, men of the 24th Infantry Division. A grateful nation whose land was plundered and whose life was threatened by the menace of communist aggression remembers these men. And a proud nation who bore these men and trained them, it remembers too and salutes them. They were the first. They fought bravely and long. This is the story of the war they fought. In June of 1950, the 24th Division was engaged in the occupation of Japan, as it had been for 4 years. Ever since the end of World War II, the men of the 24th had worked to help Japan rebuild itself. It was a productive and fruitful period. A war was past, perhaps all wars, and this was a time for peaceful pursuits. But hope for peace was already dying as 1950's summer bloomed. North of the 38th parallel in Korea, communism was readying its timetable for aggression, and a massive array of men and weapons stood poised to strike. On the 25th of June, the well-equipped North Korean army struck in force, pushed across the border, overran the South Korean defenses, and plunged the nation into war. The United Nations met promptly to counter this violation of the peace. The free nations condemned the North Korean aggression, and the decision was made to halt the invader by force. As the invader continued his sweep south despite American air and naval action, it became obvious that ground troops would be needed, and the 24th Division was alerted. First to go was a task force of 540 men and their weapons. While the rest of the division got ready to leave, these men were flown to South Korea on July 1st, the vanguard of what would later become a mighty United Nations force. orders were simply this: move north, stop them where you find them. So they started north. They moved through villages whose people stood in numb terror. And ahead they walked through towns that were ghostly still, whose people had fled in the wake of the approaching invader. And finally at Osan, with the enemy only a few hours ahead and coming fast, they made their stand. On the hill where the monument to their courage stands now, they set up their guns and they waited. They were few, and they could not win a war by themselves. But when the enemy came, they could try to delay him. For 2 days on the high ground and the low, they held the enemy back. 2 precious days. The cost was high, very high. But the time bought in blood and courage by that tiny band of warriors permitted the rest of the 24th Division to load up at Japan and get over to Korea while there still was a South Korea. For the 24th, the peaceful days of the occupation were over now. Everything it had, every man, every weapon, every vehicle had a new job. The division's regiments and battalions loaded at record speed from 5 ports along the coast of Kyushu. For the entire 24th Division, these first days of the war, the story of Osan was repeated and repeated again. Facing a powerfully equipped enemy, their mission was to fight for time until more help could come and then withdraw. On July 12th, they drew back to the Kum River line and dug in there to defend the city of Taejon. Major General Dean, the 24th Division's courageous commander, and Lieutenant General Walker, commanding general of the 8th Army, together planned the delaying strategy of this battle, one of the most bitter of the war. They were still fighting alone, and they put everything they had into it and bought a few more days of crucial time. And finally, they withdrew again, destroying their bridges behind them. Help was on the way. The 25th Infantry Division had landed at Busan and was pushing north. On the east coast, the 1st Cavalry Division landed at Pohangdong, but it was still the 24th Division's war at Taejon. They held every hill dominating the city as long as they could and fought in the valleys leading to it. And finally, they withdrew to the city itself, Taejon, a name that will live in the record of the 24th Division as long as the division itself shall live. There were no rookies left now. They were all pros, those who remained. And for 2 days straight out of hell, with ammunition running low and red artillery making an inferno of the city, they fought in the streets of Taejon. General Dean was everywhere in those raging streets, giving heart to his tired men, fighting beside them. He was taken prisoner after this battle, and it would be a long time before his division saw him again. On July 21st, the 24th Division pulled out of Taejong. They had fought the last of their lonely, delaying actions. They had fought for time and won, but it was not a victory to rejoice. The city they left behind them lay in smoking ruin, and now the world could begin to see in full measure how war would scar the face of this ancient land. They withdrew. These were familiar words now, words that could sap a fighting spirit. But they could hope now that this would be the last withdrawal. The Naptung River runs generally south along the Korean peninsula. Wide and deep, it has served many purposes in Korean history, but none more important than its use as a natural defense of the port city of Pusan. A section of this river was to be the western boundary of the 8th Army's final defense around the Pusan perimeter in the summer of 1950. The 24th Division moved back to this river and dug in. For the first time in the war, they had a position they could really defend. For the ground troops, this was a period of defense and the tightening of lines. But Allied planes took over the job of offense, carrying the war to the enemy's own positions. During the first weeks of August, the perimeter line was assaulted again and again by the enemy, who had boasted he would push the UN forces into the sea. But the line held. At Yongsan, at Changyong, at Masan in the 24th Division sector, units of the 24th repelled constant enemy attacks, while behind them, the port of Pusan filled with the troops and equipment and weapons which would turn the tide of war. By the middle of August, the line was secure. By the 25th of August, men of the 24th Division had been in combat for 55 consecutive days. Now, relieved for a while by the newly arrived 2nd Division, they rested. These were the rewards of their battle, and they were very great ones, the simple luxuries of life itself. For a short but wonderful period, they were able to relax, to catch up with the world whose news they themselves were making, and to fortify themselves for whatever lay ahead. On the 16th of September, a new phase of the war began with an Allied assault on Incheon, on the west coast of Korea, in the heart of the enemy's territory. General MacArthur, commander of the United Nations forces, himself directed the invasion of this port by the U.S. 10th Corps. Troops of the 1st Marine and 7th Infantry Divisions stormed ashore and rushed forward toward the capital city of Seoul. Simultaneously with the 10th Corps' invasion of Incheon, the 24th Division, along with the other Allied forces around the Pusan defense line, opened up on the Communists with everything they had and broke out of their perimeter. Enemy resistance was heavy, and it left its mark. But by now, the United Nations force had built into a strong and well-equipped 8th Army. This was the moment of victory it had waited for and suffered for, and it was not to be deterred. The 24th Division moved forward with new confidence. Units of the 24th, doing what they had kept the enemy from doing for so long, crossed the Naktung River every way they could on September 19th. They pushed north along the same routes they had traveled before, going the other way, past familiar landmarks. Taejun, the most familiar of them all. For the men of the 24th, there was a special kind of victory in this return to the city of their most heartbreaking defeat. The long road back was paved with victory, but it was also scarred with memories. The road back was arduous because the troops had to rebuild it, repair the bridges and the roads they had destroyed in their withdrawal, and those the enemy had destroyed in his retreat. But painstaking though it was a job that had to be done, and it was done, and the Army moved ahead. By the middle of October, the 24th Division was crossing the 38th parallel, having helped clear the area north of Seoul. By the latter part of November 1950, the division had pushed along the entire west coast of North Korea. Elements of the 24th had come to within a scant 17 miles of the Yalu River, the northernmost boundary of Korea, separating it from Red China's Manchuria. The men of the 24th Division ate Thanksgiving dinner in the snows of the North Korean mountains that year, but it was a great Thanksgiving. Victory lay just within grasp, and the hope for a Christmas at peace was more real than the biting cold of the enemy's land. But across the Yalu, in the vastness of Manchuria, lay poised a new enemy, two powerfully equipped field armies of communist China. In late November, the new enemy struck with the full force of its might, and a new battle was joined. The force behind the assault of this new enemy was too strong. He had too many men, too much fire, and the United Nations command was forced back. Thus, this new war began as the last one had, in agonizing withdrawal. The hope for Christmas peace died bitterly in the hearts of weary men. The 24th Division left behind it a scorched earth in its withdrawal. If you can't take it with you, the motto went, burn it. The roads south were clogged with refugees, homeless people, uprooted from their villages and driven into the winter cold by the terrifying threat of a communist occupation. Finally, below Seoul, the 24th Division took a determined stand, only a few miles from the spot where the first troops of the 24th had met the enemy 6 months before. Here they would resist, and they would hold against the full might of the Chinese communist forces. January 1951, the tide turned once more, and the 8th Army began moving forward again, slowly this time and painfully, fighting hard for every mile of ground against powerful communist resistance. Sometimes for the 24th Division, it was a matter of inching forward to regain lost and vital territory. By mid-March, United Nations troops were able to re-enter Seoul, the beleaguered capital city of this ravaged nation. After that, they pushed again north of the 38th parallel and were back in enemy land once more. In July of 1951, while the 8th Army held positions which could not be penetrated, the enemy took up a Russian proposal to meet with the United Nations forces to arrange a ceasefire. Little more than a year after the war began, the opposing sides met, first at Kaesong, and later at Panmunjom. The attention of the entire world was focused on this remote stretch of Korean land, marked as a neutral area in the midst of war by balloons that flew above it for almost 2 years. Through the hot, dry summer that the peace talks began, the war was a limited one, marked mainly by patrols and airstrikes. Near the end of August, the 24th Division moved into reserve, and for a month, life was one of relaxation. October of that year brought the division its last big battle of the war, an offensive action launched to take strategic high positions away from the enemy. Less than 3 months later, the 24th Division moved to Japan, where it took over the security guard of that nation and underwent rugged training for a year and a half. The 24th Division returned to Korea shortly before General Clark, the United Nations commander, in July 1953, signed the truce with the communists, ending the war, which had lasted 3 long, bitter years. With peace came Operation Big Switch, the exchange of prisoners both sides had lost. Out of the enemy's prison camps in the north came many of the 24th Division's old warriors, veterans of its roughest days, evoking memories of heroic names: Osan, Taejun, Pyongyang, Cheongju. And there was none whose return evoked stronger memories than General Dean, the 24th's commander, who had been captured at Taejun. The 24th Division was charged with the mission of sending back to communist land some of the hardcore defiant Red prisoners the United Nations forces had captured. It had yet another job, however, and a better one. In January and February of 1954, one regiment of the 24th Division took charge of the Chinese ex-prisoners of war who elected to forsake communism and return to freedom. In this last task, connected directly with the Korean action, the men of the 24th watched this phase of the war they had been involved in from the first end nobly. The proud colors of the 24th Infantry Division marched in Korea for the last time in November 1954. The men who had been the first to stand, to fight, and to fall in this first war to contain communist aggression staged a final parade over land they had fought for before returning once more to the Japan they had left. It was a solemn goodbye to a nation whose fate had been bound up with its own in days of deep trouble, and in a sense, is bound to it still. For the heroic record of the 24th Division at midpoint in the 20th century, when free men acted on their knowledge that strength and courage are the only deterrents to aggression, is written indelibly over the face of the ancient land of Korea.
The 24th Division today is in training. If it should be called on again, there is no doubt that its performance would match that of its magnificent past. Now, this is Sergeant Stuart Queen, inviting you to be with us again next week for another look at the United States Army in action on The Big Picture.
The Big Picture is a weekly television report to the nation on the activities of the Army at home and overseas. Produced by the Signal Corps Pictorial Center. Presented by the U.S. Army in cooperation with this station. You can be an important part of the big picture. You can proudly serve with the best equipped, the best trained, the best fighting team in the world today, the United States Army. Today, the latest weapons, coupled with the fighting skill of the American soldier, stand ready, on the alert all over the world to defend this country, you, the American people, against aggression. This is The Big Picture, an official television report to the nation from the United States Army. Now, to show you part of the big picture, here is Sergeant Stuart Queen.
The fighting in Korea is over. The last gunshot of that epic struggle has long since echoed through the scarred hills, adding the final period to another chapter in history. Out of that struggle have come many accounts of great suffering and even greater heroism. But few of them can match the story you are about to see. For this is the story of the famous Indian Heads, the men of the United States 2nd Infantry Division, and the vital role they played in Korea.
The date, June 28, 1950. The place, Fort Lewis, Washington. You're passing in review with the 2nd United States Infantry Division, second to none. Behind you lay months of intensive training, and now the whole outfit is razor sharp. But there's something in the air today, and everyone feels it. 3 days earlier, North Korean communists crossed the 38th parallel in an all-out invasion of South Korea. Yesterday, President Truman, with UN consent, ordered American air and sea power to aid the South Koreans. At this very moment, U.S. troops stationed in Japan were being alerted for combat, but they were few and would need support. They would need you. One month later, advance elements of the 2nd Division arrived at Busan, Korea, the first reinforcements to come directly from the United States. The situation at that time was critical. Overwhelming enemy forces had compressed the UN defenders into a tight ring around the port of Busan. Desperately holding the western sweep of this perimeter were understrength units of the 25th, 24th, and 1st Cavalry Divisions. Republic of Korea troops guarded the northern sector. 2nd Division troops were soon taking part in this heroic defense. The earlier arrivals were rushed to bolster 24th Division units along the Naktong River line, southwest of Daegu. This was the payoff for those long months of training. The communists had forced a bulge across the Naktong River. The newly arrived men of the 2nd Division teamed up with other units to flush the Reds out of the rice paddies and push them back across the river. By August 17th, the line was again intact. August 24th. With all its regiments now in Korea, the 2nd Division took over the 24th sector along the Naktong River. 7 battalions had to defend a line 40 miles long. All signs indicated a massive enemy buildup. The Reds were preparing for an all-out attempt to crush the Pusan perimeter. With Republic of Korea troops attached, the men of the division steeled themselves for their first real test of fire in the Korean War. The attack came on August 31st. For a week, the enemy tried fanatically to push through the 2nd Division sector. The thinly held line bent and wavered under the pressure, but held. The North Koreans' last major effort to push us into the sea had failed. Then the rains came, turning foxholes into waterholes, roads into quagmires. But morale was high, for the enemy had been stopped, and the UN breakout was pending. Then, on September 15, 1950, the tide of battle turned. Following in the wake of a terrific naval bombardment, troops of the U.S. 10th Corps stormed ashore at Incheon, deep in Red territory. The amphibious assault threatened to split the enemy forces in two. This was the signal for the breakout from the Pusan perimeter. After crushing heavy initial resistance, the men of the 2nd Division pushed across the Naktong River, the first U.S. soldiers to do so. One by one, the men and the vehicles made their way across the swollen river that had served them so well as a natural defense line. But that was behind them now. The time had come to take the offense. Now, from the Pusan perimeter, the entire 8th Army moved out in a coordinated overland drive. The men of the Indian Head Division pushed northward, sweeping the scattered remnants of the once powerful North Korean army before it. Tank infantry teams spearheaded the drive, bypassing thousands of trapped North Koreans in the south. Gaining momentum with each yard, units of the 2nd Division steamrolled as much as 73 miles in less than 10 hours. The retreat of the North Korean army had degenerated into a rout. By the end of September, organized resistance in South Korea had ceased. But numerous enemy pockets had been bypassed and were still waging guerrilla-type action behind our lines. The men of the Indian Head Division began to fan out rapidly in search of these bands. Clearing out these pockets of resistance was slow and dangerous work. The enemy was trapped and desperate, but showed little inclination to surrender. He had to be blasted out, hole by hole, hut by hut. The mopping up operations continued into October with excellent results. Before they were through, the men of the 2nd Division alone had killed or wounded almost 18,000 Reds, with another 7,000 captured. This represented 2.5 North Korean divisions. The Republic of South Korea once again stood free as the Red invaders were pushed back across the 38th parallel. This group of South Koreans left no doubt as to whose side they were on. Meanwhile, the battle raged in the north. A special combat group dubbed Task Force Indian Head moved into Pyongyang under fire. Their mission? To secure the airfields and guard vital installations. With Pyongyang in UN hands, plans were being formulated for a final war-ending offensive to the Yalu River. Hopes ran high that the war would be over by Christmas. But alarming reports were coming in from all sectors. Reports of Chinese troops massing along the Manchurian border. On November 27th, the reports became reality as thousands of Chinese troops attacked across the Yalu River. 5 Chinese divisions hit the Indian Heads near Kunuri, succeeding in cutting them off from the rest of the 8th Army. The situation was desperate. Soon, every unit in the division was under fire. The weather added to their miseries as the temperature began dropping rapidly, but the worst was still ahead. While rearguard troops fought fiercely on all sides, the 2nd Division began a general withdrawal. The Chinese, however, had established a long gun-studded roadblock between the division and friendly lines. At regular intervals along this fiery corridor, the columns came under the crossfire of red machine gun traps. There was nothing to do but fight it out. Throwing every man and weapon into the battle, the Indian Head Division finally broke through. Together with the rest of 8th Army, the division commenced pulling all its units back for reorganization. It was winter now, with the thermometer down to -20. By New Year's, they had reached the banks of the Han River near Seoul. The fall of the South Korean capital was imminent, as 18 full Chinese divisions poured down from the north. The fight around Kunuri had cost the 2nd Division nearly 1/3 of its strength in casualties, but the warriors still had plenty of fight left in them. The men of the division enjoyed a belated New Year's dinner before starting south again. Road movement was hampered by thousands of refugees fleeing before the advancing Chinese. By mid-January, UN forces had reorganized along a defense line extending from Pyeongtaek, well below Seoul on the west coast, northeast to Wonju. It was toward Wonju that the 2nd Division now headed. Once in the new sector, the engineers immediately set to work, leveling a division airstrip. There was no time to waste, for the Chinese were remassing their armed hordes for a new attack. The men of the 2nd Division knew this, but they were more aware of another factor, of the importance of Wonju itself. Wonju represented the right flank of the bulk of UN forces, the cornerstone that had to be held at any cost. Here, the Chinese would strike with everything they had in an attempt to envelop the entire 8th Army. Here, the men of the 2nd Division made their stand. In January and again in February, the Indian Heads hurled back wave after wave of frenzied attacks from Wonju to Chipyeong-ni. The enemy, trying to smash through the 2nd Division, ran head-on into a solid wall of fire. Chinese winter offensive ground to a halt. The 2nd Division had stopped the Chinese for the first time since they had crossed the Yalu from Manchuria. Following the decisive victory at Wanju, the 2nd Division, in conjunction with other units of the 8th Army, made ready to launch a slow, methodical counteroffensive against the Reds. All across the peninsula, the UN forces ground northward in the face of stubborn enemy resistance. They called it Operation Killer, for the main objective was not real estate, but communist casualties. General Ridgway, the 8th Army commander, put it this way: "We are interested only in inflicting maximum casualties to the enemy with minimum casualties to ourselves. To do this, we must wage a war of maneuver, slashing at the enemy when he withdraws and fighting delaying action when he attacks." The men of the Indian Head Division did just that, and with great success. While the 2nd Division made its way up the Korean Peninsula, the Chinese main forces were beginning to gather their strength for a new offensive behind a thin screen of resistance. Those Reds left behind to stop the UN troops had only one way out, and knew it. The enemy buildup continued, so that by mid-May, the Chinese were ready to turn the full force of their offensive power against the warriors in the vicinity of Inje. Destroy the 2nd Division. That was the enemy's stated purpose. The division prepared to meet this challenge. For 6 days, the enemy tried vainly to overrun the 2nd Division troops. It was to be the worst defeat suffered by the Chinese, as 19,000 casualties fell before the Indian Head guns. By the end of May, the Reds had been pushed back well north of the line from which they had launched their attack. For its heroic stand during the May action, the 2nd Division was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, highest decoration the United States can bestow upon a unit. In part, the citation read that the division demonstrated superb battlefield courage, knowledge, and discipline, and displayed such gallantry, determination, and esprit de corps as to set it apart and above other units participating in similar operations. The men of the division had succeeded in shattering the Chinese offensive power for months to come, in the action always to be remembered as the May Massacre. June and July represented a change of pace for the men of the 2nd Division as they went into reserve for a well-earned rest. Some of the units were assigned guard duty at various prisoner of war enclosures, playing military nursemaid to an enemy who, but a few weeks earlier, had tried to destroy them. Even in reserve, the bulk of the division underwent a program of intensive training designed to maintain their sharp combat edge. By late July, the division was again heading for the front, now well north of the 38th parallel. Meanwhile, significant developments were taking place on the diplomatic front. After the United Nations had crushed the Chinese spring offensive during the May Massacre, the Reds suddenly decided it was time to talk peace. Thus, on July 10th, at a place called Kaesong, UN and communist delegates met to lay the groundwork for armistice talks. Once again, hope ran high that the end of the war was near. The world waited anxiously while the delegates conferred. They didn't realize at the time that the communists intended to drag the talks through 2 years of propaganda speeches and impossible demands. No, the war was far from over in the summer of 1951, and no one knew it better than the men of the 2nd Division. While the talks bogged down, the men of the Indian Head Division advanced. The object now was commanding terrain, from which enemy movements could be observed. With Fool's Mountain began the first in a series of battles for control of the ridges. After thousands of artillery and mortar rounds were poured into the red emplacements, 2nd Division infantrymen moved out to take the hill. The Indian Head troops found the enemy well entrenched. Resistance increased steadily as they neared the crest of the hill. Finally, Fool's Mountain was in 2nd Division hands. Flying boxcars immediately rushed food and supplies to the hilltop defenders, who were then able to ward off the counterattacking Reds. With Fool's Mountain secured, division engineers moved in to clear the area of mines. The dispossessed Reds had left a great many of these calling cards behind. Then the engineers fell to the task of repairing the roads, paving the way for the infantrymen to assault their next objective, Bloody Ridge. Once again, artillery, tank, and mortar fire overtured the attack. For 3 weeks, the enemy clung stubbornly to Bloody Ridge, as tons of artillery and small arms fire blanketed his positions. The battle for Bloody Ridge raged on throughout the hot month of August, as Indian Head units followed each other in attempt after attempt to capture the crest. Then, on September 5th, they succeeded, and Bloody Ridge fell to the troops of the 2nd Division. But the smoke had hardly cleared over this hard-fought terrain when a bigger and bloodier battle began shaping up on the horizon. This piece of high ground now threatened the UN command in the 2nd Division sector. General Omar Bradley, visiting chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, received a briefing of the situation from Generals Ridgway and Van Fleet. The enemy, organizing 3 battalions from his survivors of Bloody Ridge, was making a last-ditch stand at this jagged range, soon to be known to the world as Heartbreak Ridge. Indian Head tanks, still action-warm from the previous battle, loaded up and made ready to take part in the bitter struggle ahead. Facing 4 communist divisions in the vicinity, the warriors set out to begin Operation Touchdown, as every regiment in the division was ordered to lay siege on Heartbreak Ridge. For a month, the siege continued as the Air Force teamed up with 2nd Division units to blast the Reds from the top of the hill. Finally, on October 13th, after 30 consecutive days of constant bombardment, the Reds completely withdrew from the crest of Heartbreak Ridge. After a brief period in reserve, the men of the 2nd Division soon found themselves at the front again. This was the sector known as the Iron Triangle, so called because it was formerly used by the Reds as a supply and assembly area during previous attacks against UN positions. Action now settled down to aggressive patrolling, designed to keep close tabs on all enemy movements. But the enemy didn't seem inclined to do much moving, except when pushed. In April 1952, the division was again pulled off the line and assigned various rear area duties. Some of the units assumed the thankless job of screening and guarding the die-hard communist prisoners on the island of Kojido. Others pitched in willingly to establish the 2nd Infantry Division Friendship Home near Kapyong to care for children orphaned by the war. When they returned to the line in late July, the men of the Indian Head Division discovered they were sitting right on top of a keg of dynamite by the name of Old Baldy. The Reds wanted the barren mountain as badly as we did, and for the next 2 months, the crest changed hands several times. On August 1st, Indian Head troops were in possession of the crest. Then on September 18th, the Reds recaptured Old Baldy. Heavy air and artillery fire was immediately focused on the enemy. September 20th. 2nd Division infantrymen retake the crest of Old Baldy and successfully beat off enemy counterattacks. Indian Head troops dig in to stay. With Old Baldy once again in 2nd Division hands, the Reds shifted their attacks to the nearby ridges known as Arrowhead, Pork Chop, and T-Bone Hill. From October through December, the troops defending these 3 strongholds were under constant alert as the communists tried again and again to overrun the positions. Each time, the Reds were stopped and turned back short of the top, leaving hundreds of their dead and wounded behind to litter the hillsides. In December of 1952, the men of the 2nd Division played host to 2 distinguished visitors. The first was President-elect Dwight D. Eisenhower. Then came Francis Cardinal Spellman, who visited the warriors on Christmas Day. Later, the Cardinal held a Christmas Mass and ate dinner with soldiers representing each of the Indian Head units. All prayed that the war would be over by next Christmas. Seven months later, the war in Korea ended with the signing of the armistice at Panmunjom. The United Nations had proven to the world its determination to defend free men against all armed aggression. It was proof which would make the communists think twice before starting another fight. The date? December 25th, 1953. The place? An elementary school 20 miles east of Seoul. You're with the 2nd Infantry Division, playing Santa Claus to a few hundred Korean kids. This party marks your 4th Christmas in Korea. These are the moments when you can forget names like the Pusan Perimeter, Kunu-ri, Wonju, Inje, Bloody Ridge, Heartbreak Ridge, Old Baldy, Arrowhead Ridge, the Pork Chop, T-Bone Hill, and the places in between. You're with the 2nd Infantry Division, and now, after 4 years in Korea, you're finally going home. Your job has been done, and done well. You know it, and so does the nation that had counted on you. You're with the 2nd United States Infantry Division, second to none, and proud to be aboard.
And that is the story of the United States 2nd Infantry Division in Korea. Truly, the men of the Indian Head Division have lived up to their motto, second to none. Now, this is Sergeant Stuart Queen inviting you to be with us next week for another look at the United States Army in action on The Big Picture.
The Big Picture is a weekly television report to the nation on the activities of the Army at home and overseas. Produced by the Signal Corps Pictorial Center. Presented by the United States Army in cooperation with this station. You too can be an important part of the big picture. You can proudly serve with the best equipped, the best trained, the best fighting team in the world today, the United States Army.